Even in a world where nothing seems to make sense anymore, there are still a few hard and fast rules in American politics, and here's one of them. When an incumbent office holder runs for re-election and finishes third in their own party's primary with a mere 16% of the vote, that person sucks really spectacularly at their job. Finishing third in the primary as an incumbent is, in point of fact, just about the most humiliating smackdown a candidate can receive at the ballot box. But the soon-to-be ex-Chicago mayor and noted angry bug-eyed lesbian space alien from planet Beetlejuice, Lori Lightfoot, she has just received such a smackdown. And the facts of the case, they tell a pretty simple story. She got elected, she was terrible at the job, possibly an even worse mayor than Pete Buttigieg, violent crime exploded, Chicago turned into a third world dystopian hellscape instead of a great American city. And the voters threw her out on her ass because that's how democracy works. If we elect you and you suck, we throw you out. But if you believe the fake news media performance artists, that's not what happened here at all. No, damn it, Lori Lightfoot's election defeat is a racist, homophobic hate crime. Because Chicago is a city where white supremacy always wins in the end. Just ask Jussie Smollett. He will tell you all about the horror of being a racist, homophobic hate crime victim in Chicago, or MAGA land as it's alternately known. There is literally nobody in American politics who has it tougher than the incumbent Democrat mayor of Chicago, as evidenced by the fact that no non-Democrat has held the office of mayor in that city for over 90 years, and no incumbent has failed to win re-election since 1984, and no incumbent has lost their primary since, well, ever. So Lori Lightfoot, she set out to be an historical, groundbreaking figure, and she damn well succeeded, though perhaps not in the way that she hoped. And it won't surprise you to hear that Lori Lightfoot herself, she is fully on board with the theory that her loss owes solely to racism and homophobia, possibly also misogyny, and not to her being a shitty mayor. She says her defeat shows, quote, that it's still hard to be a black woman in America, end quote. It hasn't yet occurred to her, likely never will, that her defeat is connected in any way to the fact that she's one of the honest-to-God worst mayors, possibly the number one worst mayor in the nearly 250-year history of our fair republic. And obviously the whole "I lost because I'm a gay black woman" theory doesn't go very far toward explaining how you managed to win the office in the first place 4 years ago, when you were just as gay and black and female as you are today. It's almost like you're such an unhinged egomaniac that you're willing to categorize an entire city as racist or non-racist, homophobic or non-homophobic, misogynist or non-misogynist, according to whether you happen to win an election or not. But hey, far be it from me to question any crazy person's self-delusions. You have every right to those delusions. They are yours and yours alone. It's a free country, even for wild-eyed schizoid maniacs who are also crappy mayors. And let nobody tell you different. You just go ahead and fill your head with whatever you need to in order to convince yourself that when bad things happen to you, it is never, ever, ever your own fault. Not even a little bit. And what a fine example of self-awareness and personal accountability that is for our nation's youth. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say Lori Lightfoot probably will be just fine. She will live out the rest of her natural-born life without ever having to get a real job or produce anything of value or render any meaningful service. She likely has already inked a deal to be a CNN contributor and a Washington Post guest columnist and all that good stuff, so she'll be one of those people who does literally no work except for like 6 guest opinion pieces and a couple dozen cable news hits per year, but is somehow still able to afford the lavish jet-setting lifestyle that corrupt, incompetent ex-politicians have come to expect here in the United States of America. And when she's writing those opinion pieces and doing those cable news hits, you know what they're all going to be about? They're going to be about how difficult and unfair it is being a gay black woman in America. But you know who else I got to thinking about when I was considering the strange case of Lori Lightfoot? I got to thinking about her Canadian folk singer cousin, Gordon Lightfoot, and which of his songs might perhaps deserve to get the William Shatner parody treatment in honor of Lori Lightfoot's election defeat. I've narrowed it down to 2 candidates, I think, so tune in Saturday morning to find out the winner. And though it's ever so much fun to heap well-deserved mockery and derision upon malignant narcissist power trippers like the soon-to-be former mayor of Chicago, She can take solace in the fact that she is actually, legitimately, an historic figure. Why? Because if you say the words angry lesbian to me, Lori Lightfoot is the person whose face I picture, and maybe that will be her lasting contribution to American culture, replacing the nauseatingly Caucasian Rosie O'Donnell as the standard exemplar of the perfect angry lesbian archetype. Another glass ceiling shattered, I say. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where the wind's blowing so hard it could power a small fan for perhaps 17 minutes, good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I'm your eponymous host and humble servant. And I think I rather like this format of dispensing with the current events in the open and doing something of historical interest in the main segment, so I think I might stick with it for the time being, if that's all right with you all. And there just happens to be a very interesting anniversary today of an event that used to be very well known, but is much less so now, the Kronstadt Rebellion, in which hostilities commenced 102 years ago today on Tuesday, the 1st of March, 1921. For reasons on which I will expound shortly, this is a story you'll want to pay particular attention to if you have a young person in your life, as regrettably many of us do, who's having a flirtation with some form of Marxist-Leninist thought, as, let's face it, most American kids and young adults are, technically. Many of them just don't realize it. So for every kid who says, yes, I am a committed Bolshevik, I have read Das Kapital, I've read the Communist Manifesto, I'm waving the banner, workers of the world unite, there's probably a couple thousand other kids who don't have the faintest idea that they've been inculcated into Marxist-Leninist modes of thinking, because today's brand of Bolshevism doesn't come waving a red banner and singing the Internationale. It comes waving the rainbow flag and wearing a pronoun pin. But the intended destination is exactly the same, and that is Marxist tyranny, with all the speech codes and prison camps and political repression and secret police and all the other fun stuff that entails. And the story of the Kronstadt Rebellion is a story about how quickly the promises of communist utopia evaporate when you actually try to run a country along Marxist-Leninist lines, and how the people who live in countries that fall to communism often don't realize the true odious nature of the beast until it is too late to correct the mistake. Kronstadt is a city on an island, Kotlin Island to be specific, located in the Gulf of Finland, just a few miles offshore from what was then Petrograd, and was originally St. Petersburg, and was later Leningrad, but is now St. Petersburg again, and then as now it was the home port of the Russian Baltic Fleet, which by 1921 was the Soviet Baltic Fleet, but is now again the Russian Baltic Fleet. And the Kronstadt Rebellion, to give the best Cliff Notes summation I can, was basically a mass insurrection by everybody on that island, civilian and military alike, against what they viewed as the depredations and blunders of the Bolshevik government that had taken over the country at the end of the Civil War in the previous year, in 1920. It was also the last serious uprising against the Soviet communist regime for the next 7 decades, until the abortive October coup of 1991, when the Red Army attempted to depose Gorbachev in hopes of preserving the Soviet Union, but they failed spectacularly, and the USSR ceased to exist less than 60 days later. And if you're asking yourself right now, wait, how come there were no meaningful public uprisings for 70 years when communism was so obviously evil and a huge majority of the population hated it? Well, that's a heck of a good question, and I'll tell you why that is. It's because after the Kronstadt Rebellion, they finished the work of disarming the populace that they had started during the Civil War. And you know how these things go. This ain't your first damn rodeo if you're in this audience. So first you got, oh gosh, mister, we sure hate to confiscate your rifles, but we got this civil war going on, and we need all the weaponry we can get for our brave boys on the front lines. You don't want our brave boys on the front lines to have no rifles, do you, mister? And then a little later on it becomes, gosh, mister, we sure do hate to confiscate your shotgun and your pistol, but we just finished this big civil war, and we're running really low on guns, so you understand, the army needs them. You don't want our brave boys defending our national frontiers to have no pistols, do you, mister? And then eventually it becomes, gosh, mister, we sure do hate to confiscate all your slingshots and crossbows, But we just had this big rebellion in Kronstadt, and we can't run the risk of any more counter-revolutionary activity like that. You wouldn't want any counter-revolutionary activity to happen, would you, mister? It doesn't matter how you answer, because you're going to the gulag anyway. Just because we feel like being dicks. And if you were thinking that Kronstadt was some sort of anti-Bolshevik city in its political character, it totally was not. Most of the people there, they were staunchly pro-Bolshevik. Or at least they were. Back when communism was presented to them as just a bunch of happy talk in a sales brochure, back when Lenin and his crowd were promising everybody that, well, sure, I mean, every place in the new Soviet Union is going to have communist governance, but there's also going to be local autonomy. Don't you worry. Who the party officials are in your area, that's going to be totally up to the people there. But when they saw what the reality looked like, that Soviet communism was going to be a story of top-down, brute force, hyper-centralized authoritarianism, with every single decision about every single thing, everywhere, being made from within the walls of the Kremlin in Moscow, well, they decided they don't like being lied to. And in the Navy, they felt particularly betrayed because it was a series of naval mutinies that had first triggered the downfall of the Tsar back in 1917 and kicked off the Civil War that culminated in the creation of Communist Russia. So now, a few years later, in 1921, these sailors and officers, they're thinking, you guys are in power largely because we put you there, but everything you promised us was horse shit. So from where we're sitting, Soviet communism doesn't look all that much preferable to Tsarist autocracy. In fact, it might be worse. So we fucking quit. We reject your government. We won't mess with you. We'll keep ourselves on our little island over here. We'll mind our own business. But if you come and try to start shit, we will fight you. And fight them they did, beginning 102 years ago today. Now, in addition to being a fascinating and instructive story in the realm of political history, this incident is also pretty cool as a matter of military history, because how many battles can you name where the attacking force, a division-sized force, advanced to their objective on foot over a frozen ocean? Myself, I can only think of one, but if there's another one, tell me what it is, because that one gets its own episode too, damn it. So on the 1st of March, there's a big demonstration on the island, about 15,000 people. The local Soviet, they have passed a 15-point ultimatum, which consists mostly of basic civil rights stuff, like we want to elect our own leaders and govern ourselves locally and be left the hell alone. And they dispatch a group of sailors to go across the bay and deliver the ultimatum to the capital. And the sailors are never seen again, because this is Russia, after all. Who knows, maybe they all jumped out of a 6th-floor window after shooting themselves once in each side of the head in a traditional Russian suicide. Now, the townsfolk and the Navy folk, on the not unreasonable assumption that their messengers have been killed, they decide, okay, that's it, time to commence hostilities. But they first round up all of the outside Communist Party officials and eject them from the island, even though one might have expected reprisal killings under those circumstances, so I think it has to be said that's a rather remarkable show of restraint on the part of the rebels. The Red Army starts sending troops in the following day, 2nd of March. At first, they're just sending, like, little squad-sized detachments, not so much to fight necessarily, but to try and talk the defenders into capitulating. This goes on for a few days, with the regrettable result from the Red Army perspective that most of the guys they sent in, after talking with the rebels and hearing their views on things, well, they switched sides and joined the rebellion. So now that all we've done is bolster the numbers of the other guys, how about let's cut the foreplay and get down to the making whoopee? Which they do, but not until after a few more days of ultimately fruitless negotiations. Finally, on the morning of 7 March, the battle well and truly begins. The Red Army sends 60,000 men across the bay, all of them infantry, because you can't very well bring horses and trucks and tanks unless you want to decorate the bottom of the bay with them and drown a bunch of your own guys in the process. The rebels have a strength around 11,000 armed effectives, give or take, but crucially, and not to their advantage, is the fact that most of their military personnel are sailors. So aside from however many Marines they happen to have in their ranks, they don't have anybody who is trained to fight or direct a land battle. But what they do have is a fortified position and a week of advance notice in which to build defensive works. On the first day, the attack gets repulsed but not by the defenders as much as the blinding snowstorm that they were trying to walk through on ice, which sounds fun. Only a few elements of that 60,000 strong force actually managed to complete the 3-mile advance and reach the shores of the island, only to immediately turn back around and go back when the attack was called off. Well, some of them turned around and went back, that is. The others said, "Fuck that, I'm cold, I'm defecting to the rebels, it's a way shorter walk." The snowstorm persists for a couple days, and then the Red Army has a bright idea. Let's go in there with airplanes and drop bombs on them. Because you can do that now. Did you know that? But as you might expect from a 1921 Russian bombing raid, it doesn't achieve much of anything. Then they try a couple more ground attacks, or ice attacks, as the case may be. But they are turned back with increasingly appalling casualties. It's not until 16 March that there's a sufficient confluence of favorable weather and willpower to stop beating around the bush and take the damn island with overwhelming force of arms. And they do wind up taking the island, because, of course they do. There is no amount of righteous moral courage and plucky determination that can overcome a 6-to-1 numerical disadvantage, after all. But though the final result was always rather a foregone conclusion, the Bolsheviks wound up paying one hell of a butcher's bill for taking this little island. 10,000 killed, wounded, or missing out of a force of 60,000 for a casualty rate of 17%, which that's a pretty appalling casualty rate in the rest of the world, but I guess by Russian standards it's fairly unremarkable. In Stalingrad, Red Army have 137% casualty rate. The defenders, perhaps surprisingly when you consider the other guys were engaged in a mass infantry assault against a fortified position over 3 miles of freaking ice, they had a near-identical casualty rate, 1,600 killed and wounded from a force of 10,000. At least when you're attacking over ice, you never have to tell your guys to take cover. Makes the work of the NCOs quite a bit easier, I would think. And I guess it all depends anyway on how you compute the casualty rate. 2,500 of the rebels were taken prisoner at the end of the battle, most or all of whom we can probably safely assume perished shortly thereafter, and not necessarily by natural causes. So if you include all of them in the total, then you are looking at a much more appropriately Russian 41% casualty rate. The rebels in Kronstadt thought they were fighting for principles that had broad public support throughout the country. They thought they were kicking off a third revolution that was going to correct the mistakes and the excesses of the early Bolshevik period, that millions would rise up and join their cause. And it's possible that millions probably would have liked to do that. But when you're starving to death and have no weapons at your disposal, your capacity for effective armed resistance is significantly degraded. So does this story have a moral? Yes. Yes, it does. And it's 5 words long. Take it away, Chuck.
From my cold, dead hands.
Thank you very much indeed for watching. See you Saturday. Have a pleasant tomorrow. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.